Thank you, Andrei, for reminding that. It's my pleasure today to introduce you our colleague, Colin Price. He's a researcher and lecturer in atmospheric sciences in the School of Geosciences in Tel Aviv University, and he also the head of the Porter School of Environmental Sciences. And Colin is well-recognized scientist in atmospheric electricity and lightning. And what is important, especially important, is that he is the scientific supervisor of the new lab created several years ago in the Nizhny Novgorod Institute for Applied Physics. And this lab works on a variety of problems related to parameterization of atmospheric electricity in climate models and weather models, and also the impacts of atmospheric electricity on biological systems. So today, I think that we also we'll be able to see some results from the work of this laboratory, and of course, in the general picture of the field of atmospheric electricity connections to climate. So before I hand over words to Colin, so I'm just remind our rules. I would say that we do not interrupt the speaker during his talk, but we can write our questions to chat, and also after the talk we will have the possibility, everyone will have possibility to ask a question to our speaker. So Andrei, is that all I had to tell?
Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay, so Colin, this is your time now.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk. And I was asked to speak about modeling, since this is, I think, supercomputing workshop or conference, about how we can model lightning and thunderstorms in models, which is fairly difficult, as I'll explain during my talk. But first of all, why do we want to do this? Why are we interested in lightning and thunderstorms? Well, I think it's fairly obvious to many people, but to give you a few directions, first of all, many people are killed and injured by lightning every year. The estimate is something like 24,000 people are killed, although this is very uncertain, I think. We don't have very good data about the deaths from lightning. But there may be 10 times more, hundreds of thousands that are maybe injured by lightning, with both short-term and long-term injuries, whether it's memory failure, pains, many different medical concerns from people who have been struck or injured by lightning. And so this is a hazard, obviously, to, first of all, to the public, to workers outside, people working in stormy environments, farmers in agriculture. In addition, we have many sensitive infrastructures and equipment which is sensitive to lightning. The power grid for the electricity power grid gets struck by lightning quite often, causing power outages. So this is important to keep the power up. But other more recent equipment and infrastructures like wind turbines from renewable energy, the wind turbines are put in locations which are flat, and the wind turbines can be very high above the surface with pointed turbines, and therefore many of them are getting struck by lightning now. And this is causing damages of millions of dollars for every turbine which is being struck and taken out of action. So this is a new field of lightning protection for wind turbines, which is important. Aviation is obviously, there's a hazard from lightning. On average, every commercial airline gets struck by lightning about once every year. Obviously, they have a Faraday cage, so they're built to withstand the lightning discharge, the electric discharge, but still the damages are caused and it's a hazard, and flights have to be rerouted around thunderstorms to prevent the other problems of turbulence and maybe hail in the thunderstorms. And so understanding the global distribution, and maybe if this is going to change in the future, is important for aviation. Lightning is also a major cause of forest fires, especially in your part of the world, in the boreal forests in Russia, Siberia, parts of Europe and Canada and the US. Tens of thousands of fires are caused every year from lightning. And as the climate changes and gets drier, perhaps, and hotter, and maybe more lightning, we'll talk about that later on, this is going to become more important for fires, and we actually see the lightning maybe moving further and further north in the summer months, resulting in more damage to the forests and the area burnt by lightning. When we talk about scientific interests, lightning produces NOx, nitrogen oxides, either NO or NO2, and these gases are a precursor of ozone in the atmosphere, and ozone we know is a greenhouse gas. And so in the troposphere, when we have increases in ozone, this is not good. It's a poisonous gas for humans and animals, and also plants and materials perish when they have, if there's high concentrations of ozone. So the link between lightning and NOx and ozone is also a very interesting topic, and how this may even feed back on the climate by trapping in infrared radiation. And finally, lightning is maybe an indicator of severe weather. We can think of lightning as the pulse of thunderstorms, the same as when we're doing a lot of exercise and running, our body pulse goes up and starts to beat a lot faster than when we're relaxed and lying down. Thunderstorms also have a certain pattern and signature of lightning activity, and sometimes we can use this information to give very short-term forecasts of severe weather, like tornadoes, heavy rainfall, wind damage. And we've also done some research on tropical storms to show that the electrical activity in these huge storms often peaks one day before the peak in the wind speeds of the tropical storms. So lightning is kind of giving us some information of what's happening within the storms, and maybe can be used also to give early warnings to public or to governments or emergency managers about the likelihood of severe weather in the next hours. So for those who are not familiar of lightning distribution around the planet, here we can see where lightning occurs on the planet. The color shading is the actual flash density, so the flashes per square kilometer per year. This is from satellite data from NASA, a 5-year climatology, which is showing basically that the lightning activity is basically over the continents. We have 90% of the lightning activity is over 30% of the planet, over the continents. And in fact, the oceans, 70% of the planet, have very little lightning activity. So this is also an interesting topic of research of why we have such a different amount of lightning over the land compared with the oceans, whether this is a thermodynamical effect, whether this is an aerosol effect, maybe a surface properties effect or others. Research keeps on going in this area, but I think most people believe this is a thermodynamic effect, that the land surface simply warms up much more quicker during the daytime by the sun than the oceans. The sun's rays heat maybe a few meters, even tens of meters of seawater during the day, where the land surface is heated only down to maybe a few centimeters of soil. And so the air temperatures increase much more rapidly over the land during the day than they do over the oceans, resulting in instabilities in the atmosphere, which then produce convection and thunderstorms. If we put this in motion, this plot is actually this, I'll leave it like this, I don't want to play around with it, but you can see that the thunderstorms are basically moving north and south of the equator with the seasons. The date at the top is not a specific year, it's an average again of 5 years. This is data collected from optical sensors on satellites, which have been collected over 5 years. And we can see that the lightning activity, again, shown in the color shading, is a maximum in the hemisphere where we have summer. So when we're in the northern hemisphere summer, around about now on the image, June, July, August, most of the lightning is north of the equator. And in December, January, February, most of the lightning is south of the equator. And again, mainly over the tropical or mainly over the continental land masses. So a few words about lightning. I'll talk a little bit later about the actual generation of lightning, but that we need to also know about if we want to simulate lightning in models. We need to be able to, first of all, duplicate what we see in nature. And if we look at this cartoon about different types of lightning, we see that we have different charge structures in thunderstorms. Generally, around about the -15-degree region, we have negative charging on the hydrometeors. This region between about 0 degrees and maybe -40 degrees is what we call the mixed phase region of the cloud, because we can have supercooled water. We can have water droplets below freezing, below 0 degrees, but they're still liquid in the atmosphere. And we know that when you fly in these parts of the clouds, -15, -20, even to -30, 35 degrees, you can still find liquid droplets. Very unstable, but they can still be liquid, mixed in with ice crystals and hail and graupel. Graupel is soft hail. And in the laboratories, we know that we need this mixture of different types of hydrometeors, both liquid, both solid, to interact with each other to produce the charging. And normally we get the negative charging around this -15 degrees, and higher up in the very cold parts of the cloud, below -40 degrees, where there's no liquid water, we have only ice crystals up here, and the ice crystals are generally positively charged on the ice crystals, and often we find a small pocket of positive charge also near the cloud base. Now, obviously, when we get to a certain, the electrical charge will grow and grow as the cloud develops, and we have more interactions between the particles. And if we pass a certain threshold of the electric field between these charge centers, then we get a basically short circuit where we have a spark or lightning produced, most often in the cloud. So about 70% of lightning activity is between these different charge centers inside the cloud, and only about 25 to 30% of the lightning is actually coming to the ground. And most of the cloud to ground lightning comes from this negative charge region we call negative CG, negative cloud to ground. But it's possible to also get cloud to ground from the positive region, either the top or the bottom of the cloud coming to the ground. But that's also only about 5–10% of, depending on the season, depending on the location, of the total lightning coming to the ground. And there are some other fairly rare types of lightning which go out to the air, up into the upper atmosphere and between clouds. But generally, most of the lightning is either within thunderstorms, between the different charge centers, or to the ground. So how do we simulate this in climate models? Well, it's not easy, because the main reason, if we look at this cartoon of a climate model, when we have a climate model, we have to simulate the whole planet, because things are interacting, the mass and energy and momentum are moving around in the atmosphere. And we can't just simulate it over the Mediterranean or over Europe, because what happens over the Atlantic or even over the United States will affect the weather and the climate over Europe, for example, the Gulf Stream. And what happens over the Arabian Peninsula will affect what happens maybe in India, and what happens over Australia will maybe have effects of Africa. So we have to simulate these globally, and because of the computer limitations, we have to divide the world into grid boxes. You can think of this as kind of the pixels on your digital camera. And these pixels, grid boxes, the smaller they are, the more intense the computer's power we need to solve these equations. And so the best models today are down to maybe 1 degree by 1 degree grid boxes. That's still about 100 kilometers on a side. And if we go down to half a degree, that's 50 kilometers. But as you can see, most of these models, if you look at a cloud or the lightning, these are what we call sub-grid scale processes. We cannot actually simulate these because we don't have all the information, what's happening on the sub-grid scale. We don't know what's happening in the cloud, the types of particles. And this is the basic problem we have for these small scale processes, both small spatially, but also small temporally. Lightning can have a lightning discharge is only a few milliseconds, whereas in the model we have time steps of 15 minutes or an hour. And spatial, as I mentioned, the spatial resolution, if we really want to do the microphysics, we have to go down to the micrometer scale to try to understand the interactions between droplets, or at least meters maybe. But in the climate models, we have scales of tens, if not hundreds of kilometers. So this is the basic problem we have. And 30 years ago, during my PhD, I worked on this. And we basically tried to find parameters, both in the real world and in the model, which are related to lightning and thunderstorm development. And what we found, basically from observations of radar, is that the height of the cloud, if we look at this example, convective cloud in this grid box, the depth in the atmosphere, how high it goes in the atmosphere, is related to the intensity of the convection, which from observations, radar measurements and other measurements show that the more intense the updrafts, the deeper the clouds, the more lightning we have. And so we developed a fairly simple, crude relationship between the flash rate in a specific grid box, both in reality and in the models, related to the height, the cloud top height to the fifth power, a power law here, the fifth power over land, and a different relationship over the oceans. And this is because the observations, as I showed you, show significantly less lightning activity over the oceans. And this is because we have different microphysics and different dynamics in the convection over the oceans. The storms may go very deep in the atmosphere, but the updrafts are very weak, and so the electrification is very weak, and so we need to really separate out the relationships between land and ocean. And I admit that this is a very crude and very simplistic estimate of thunderstorms and lightning, and I would never have dreamed back 30 years ago that people are still using this today. And even today, 30 years later, some simulations in climate models still find that this is the simplest and gives the best results. But I'll show you some other ideas that people have come up with in the last 30 years, but not necessarily better in all ways. Now that gives the total lightning, but if we're looking for hazards or for forest fires, for aviation, we need to also know the different types of lightning, for example, in the cloud and to the ground. The intra-cloud lightning is inside the cloud to ground to the surface. And what we found is that basically there's also a nice empirical relationship that we found of this ratio related to the cold cloud thickness. Now, what do I mean by the cold cloud thickness? The cold cloud is the cloud which is below 0 degrees centigrade. So if we look where the freezing level is, and the altitude of the freezing level, and we know the height of the cloud at every time step, we can actually see how thick it is in kilometers. So what's the distance from the freezing level to the cloud top? And as that gets thicker and deeper, we actually see an increase mainly in the intracloud lightning, maybe not necessarily in the cloud to ground, but this ratio seems to be linked to this parameter. And so we had a second parameterization, which would be able to differentiate between the in-cloud lightning and the cloud to ground lightning. So if we have a look at how good the NASA model did with this parameterization, on the left we have observations from the OTD satellite, again a NASA satellite, of optical measurements of lightning, but this is again, well, I didn't mention it, but this is a low Earth orbit satellite, which means that it's taking a snapshot and then it moves on and takes another snapshot. So over a month or two, it'll gather all the statistics but it's actually missing most of the data because it's not a geostationary satellite. Nevertheless, on the left, we have June, July, August, averaged for 3 months, so the summer in the Northern Hemisphere in 1995, a single year. The bottom, we have December, January, February 96, and December 95 and January, February 96, the winter season. And we can see the shading tells us it's a log scale here. The shading shows us where we see the lightning mainly over the tropical land masses, also some in the winter area over the warm oceans, the Gulf Stream, the Mediterranean. And in the summer months, you see up into Europe and Siberia and up into Alaska, we get lots of lightning. On the right-hand side, we have the model. And the model is showing a climatology for those months, not a specific year. So June, July, August for many years in the present day climate with the present day amount of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. And December, January, February. So Northern Hemisphere winter, Northern Hemisphere summer on the top. And again, the model shows it's again the same log scale here, showing lightning activity focused over the tropical continental regions and the seasonal differences. A fairly good agreement actually between them. The model is showing maybe a little bit more lightning over the oceans, but I want to make the point here as well, and that when we compare model and data and observations, we always have to remember that also the observations are not perfect. I've worked basically all my scientific career with data, with observations, so I know that observations are not always that great, and there are lots of holes in the data. There can be problems with detection efficiencies, and so while there are lots of problems with the models, there are also problems with the data, and so we shouldn't always assume that the data is the ground truth, the best comparison. It's the best we have, but it's not the truth. Nevertheless, we see a fairly good agreement between the two. Now, if we want to move on to additional types of parameterizations to use various parameters, another one we developed is from a student which we published in Keren and Mazuman in 2004 by looking at the link between climate parameters and thunderstorm clusters. So here it's less trying to simulate the lightning itself, but more the thunderstorms. And what we see here is actually some raw data of lightning. Each circle here is a lightning flash over a 1 hour period in East Africa. And using a clustering scheme, we can actually cluster the lightning into thunderstorm cells. So this blue, the colors don't mean anything. They just show different cells. So this would be one thunderstorm cell where we have this lightning over here. This red one would be another cell, and there are a few smaller cells which are starting to develop, or maybe they're decaying. And in this way, we can actually map out the number of thunderstorms at any time, at any location, based on actual observations of lightning. This is using the Woolen WWLLN Global Lightning Network, which again is not seeing all the lightning, but it's giving us a good global distribution in time and space. And then, as for an example for Africa, we can take the climate box, and this is looking, for example, the NCEP Reanalysis, which is a similar spatial size as, say, a climate model, a global climate model, maybe 2.5 degrees by 2.5 degrees. That's 250 kilometers by 250 kilometers. So again, thunderstorms are occurring on much smaller scales. And here we can see basically in orange, within one of these climate model pixels, we can see the actual sub pixel scale of the thunderstorm clusters that I just showed you in the previous slide. So wherever we see orange here, we see that we've actually measured lightning from the global network. And what we do is after the cluster, we can get two parameters here. We can get the number of clusters for every climate grid box. So we have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 thunderstorms. And we can also get the area covered by these thunderstorms inside the climate pixel. So here, if you count the pixels, you'll come to 13. And 13, we can multiply that by the size of the pixel to get the actual area in square kilometers covered by thunderstorms in this climate pixel. Then the idea is, okay, let's go to every climate pixel and look for climate parameters that can say something that are correlated with these thunderstorm cells. So we found two parameters, at least over Africa in this study, which were well correlated with the thunderstorm number and thunderstorm area. And those are the lifted index and the specific humidity. Specific humidity is the absolute amount of water vapor in that climate grid box in grams per kilograms at the surface. As we know that the more water vapor we have in the atmosphere, the lower the density of the air. If we have moist air, it's a lower density than dry air, and this helps with the convection, the triggering of convection, the temperature and the humidity together. And the lifted index is a stability index, which is basically looking at the difference in temperature vertically between, say, 500 hectopascal and the surface. And this tells us something about the lapse rate and how unstable the atmosphere is. And normally the lifted index, when it's negative, we have an unstable atmosphere. When it's positive, we have a stable atmosphere. And again, the more water vapor we have, the lighter the air, the less dense the air. And that air can also be used for condensation and release of latent heat, which will again give a push, an updraft for the storms to develop. And it may be difficult to see here, but the more water vapor we have in a pixel at the surface and the more negative the lifted index, the more thunderstorms we observe in reality and the larger the area covered by those thunderstorms. So this is some scatter here, obviously, and we could then develop an empirical model based on the climate model scale, and we can then translate this to thunderstorms, not necessarily lightning. So here's a comparison between January 2014. There are two different ways we can actually simulate them using this mean forecast or the random forecast. I don't want to go into the details, but these are two different methodologies of using the climate variables to estimate thunderstorm number, which you can see on the side, the number of clusters per square degree per day. And on the right-hand side, you can actually see the observed numbers. So the spatial distribution is actually fairly good. This monthly mean, this is the actual data for January 2014, and this is the simulated data. Maybe underestimating it somewhat, but the spatial distribution is fairly good. If we do the same exercise for July 2014, so these are the two estimations of thunderstorms for that month. And on the right, we see the actual observed clusters from the lightning data, which is then clustered. And again, the main centers where we have the thunderstorm activity, the spatial distribution is fairly well reproduced here. Now we can then take these climate parameters and see how they may have varied over time. If we go back here, we've basically got two climate variables, specific humidity, lifted index, which are telling us something about thunderstorms. And we can use the Reanalysis data sets to go back to 1948. So here we can see from 1948 to 2017, I think it is, in blue, we have the annual mean number of clusters over Africa. This is only for Africa. And we've also plotted here the temperature data in black for that same period. And we see both of them are increasing. In fact, from 1990s, it appears that the thunderstorms and the temperatures are increasing more rapidly over Africa. And so by using these kind of empirical relationships, we can look at long-term trends in thunderstorm activity. And if we put every point on this plot, one against the other, so we have the number of clusters in blue and the area of the clusters in red and the temperature on the x-axis, we can get here, we can basically put a linear regression and get a fit in showing that these parameters are correlated by about correlation of about 0.75, 0.74, implying that the temperature explains about 55% of the variability in the thunderstorm parameters, both the number and the area over this period over Africa. And if we fit this with a linear regression, we get a sensitivity which shows that we get about a 40% increase in the number of thunderstorms in a response for a 1 degree Kelvin warming from 1950s to the 2010s. This is a change in the number of thunderstorms, not in the amount of lightning, which is what the GCMs did before. I should also point out that recently another student has been looking at South America, and we've been working also with Evgeny and Nikolai. And here we can see now the observed clusters on the left side. This is observed data over South America for January. I forget what, I don't have the year here. And this is the actual simulated based on the climate parameters using two different methodologies. We can see that the spatial distribution seems to agree fairly nicely. And here we found something very interesting, that when we look at the long-term changes, again, we have data from the 1940s, but here it's from 1979 to 2020. The blue curve shows the changes in the number of thunderstorms. The yellow curve shows the change in temperature. And here we see that while we have an increase in temperature, we actually have a decrease in thunderstorms over South America. This is very surprising initially, but when we looked at the difference between these two periods, say the 1980s minus the 1990s, these two decades, sorry, the 2010s, so this is the 1980s, where we had lots of thunderstorm activity, 2010s where we have less, and we look at where the change is actually occurring. Why is it decreasing? We get the spatial distribution where we see that in the yellows, we had more thunderstorm activity in 1980 than in the 2010s, and in the blues, it was the opposite. And we found this very interesting pattern here, where we have the maximum change in thunderstorm activity. And we started to investigate it, and it appears that this is related to where we have some massive deforestation in the Amazon, in the southern part of the Amazon. Here we can see the percentage of deforestation occurring in the southern part of the Amazon jungle. This is a paper which was published, which looks at the changes in the carbon, in teragrams of carbon per pixel, but from 2001 to 2019, not exactly the same period as us, but still showing that a dramatic decrease in the forest coverage. This leads to also less latent heat release from the surface, less moisture for convection to develop, and therefore we think that this is actually having an influence on the formation of thunderstorms, and hence the deforestation has actually caused a reduction in thunderstorm activity over time over South America. And if you look at the relationship between the total carbon from deforestation here for every pixel compared with the changes in lightning activity, we get this fairly clear linear relationship that as we have more deforestation, we have less and less thunderstorms over South America. So this was something interesting we found, which we weren't expecting, which can be used when we're looking back in time at how thunderstorms may have changed in the past. Well, is there any evidence that thunderstorms have changed, increased or decreased in the past? Well, as I mentioned, we don't really have long periods of lightning data, maybe a decade or two, and that's been changing over time because the sensors have changed. We have more sensors, less sensors, so it's difficult to look at trends. So the next best thing was to look at what we call thunder days. Now, thunder day is a day that the weatherman, the meteorological observer at a specific station, will actually hear thunder. Obviously, we only have thunder if you have lightning, but you don't have to see the lightning in order to hear the thunder. But you do need to be fairly close, within, say, 25 to 30 kilometers from the actual lightning discharge to hear the thunder, because the sound waves get refracted in the atmosphere. But if we look at the data from Sao Paulo, we can see from 1950s to 2000, there does appear to be an increase in the days in the year that have thunders. Now, the maximum days is 365. You can't have more than that, approximately 30 days per month at maximum. In 1950s, there were about 60 days a year with thunderstorms in Sao Paulo. And by the year 2000, we can see it's more than 90 days. Quite a dramatic increase, although there is quite a bit of variability. And this, they claim, is also linked to increasing temperatures. Here we have a slope of about 3.6 degrees per century, giving it a sensitivity of about a 10% increase in thunder days for every 1 degree warming. We'll see that this is similar to what the climate models show for lightning changes as a function of temperature. And just to show you a few other locations, if we look at high latitude places like Alaska, 65 degrees north, not too much lightning there, not too many thunder days, but they're very sensitive to these changes. So if we see what happened in 1950, only about 4 days every year with thunderstorms in Alaska, and that's gone up to maybe 10 days in 2010. So although there is a lot of scatter here, this is maybe a 300% change over a century in the high latitude lightning activity. And a recent paper also by Holtzworth has shown that the lightning activity just in the last 10 years, from 2010 to 2019, has increased quite dramatically in the Arctic Circle, north of 66.6 degrees in the Northern Hemisphere. In Australia, they see similar changes in thunder days as well as in Japan. And so I'm only showing the best cases. There are other places which show less increases, and some even show decreases in lightning locally. But generally, we're seeing an increase in the thunder days over the long period, which seems to match what we see also in our other studies. As we get better computers and we can go down into higher spatial resolution, we can start to simulate lightning based on microphysics and not on large-scale bulk parameters like the lifted index or specific humidity or CAPE or other things. So a few words about lightning electrification. In order to get lightning, we need to develop electric fields, large electric fields in clouds, and we need to go through 3 different stages. The first stage is the charge separation within individual cloud particles, whether they're droplets or they're ice crystals. We have to separate out the positive and the negative charge to different parts of the particle. And this can be done either through inductive processes, when we have an external electric field. An external electric field can polarize droplets and ice crystals and then separate the positive and negative charge to different parts of the individual particle. For this, we really need an external field. And so this process may happen later on in the development of thunderstorms. As the field is increasing, it can actually influence these inductive processes. But how do we start the process? For this, we need non-inductive processes. And so there's been a lot of study in the laboratories, simulations of non-inductive processes, which result from melting of ice, the change in phase from water to ice and back again, temperature gradients within ice crystals due to the freezing in different parts of the cloud, which can result in the separation of charge. And so there's a lot of research and maybe more research that needs to be done on the micro scale of what's happening on individual particle scales. Once we've separated in an individual particle, we actually have to then generate particles which are either positively or negatively charged. And this can occur in 3 ways. Firstly, these droplets or ice crystals can simply collide with each other and break up. And if you have the separation of the positive and negative charge, and then you break up either a droplet or ice crystal, then you can leave part of it either positively charged or negatively charged. Another way is by collisions between particles. And during the time of the collision, we can have charge transfer from the one to the other. And one particle can lose negative charge and is left with the overall positive charge. Another one can gain negative charge and becomes overall negative. And we can also have a possibility of ion capture by cloud particles. We have ions in the atmosphere, which can be scavenged by cloud particles to give them a net charge. And so the second step is to actually get particles in the cloud, ice, growlpool, maybe even droplets, which have positive charge or negative charge. But that doesn't give us an electric field. We then have to go to the third stage, and to actually on the macro scale, we have to separate the charge in the cloud so that we have different pockets of positive and negative charge. And this is caused mainly by the updrafts and the downdrafts, which cause gravitational separation. The lighter, smaller particles, which generally have positive charge, get carried up with the updrafts into the top of the cloud above the levels of -40 degrees, giving us mainly positive charge in the top of the cloud. And the heavier, more massive hail or droplets, grapple, normally get negative charge, and they fall down to the bottom of the cloud, and therefore we can actually have the physical macro separation between the positive and the negative charge, where the negatives generally come down to the base of the cloud, the positives go up to the top of the clouds, and therefore we can develop the large-scale electric field which is needed for us to eventually have a lightning discharge. So for this reason, some people have started, and my colleagues in this other work we did, published in 2010, to develop what we call the lightning potential index, LPI, where we assume that the charge separation is by the non-inductive mechanism where ice and grapple will collide together. And this has been studied heavily in the laboratory by Takahashi and Saunders. And the electric field buildup is proportional to the concentration of these interacting particles and the velocity gradient between them. So if the velocity is very weak, then we don't have many collisions between these particles. But if we have very intense velocity, updrafts and downdrafts, then there's many interactions and lots of transfer of charge between them, and we reduce the time that it takes to get to the threshold of breakdown in the cloud and for lightning to occur. So both the concentration of these ice particles, grapple, but also the updraft velocity is very important. And this lightning potential index is basically an index which we integrate over the volume of the cloud in the charging zone between 0 and -20 degrees. And it looks at the total flux of ice and water within this zone. And so we can see that this is measured in joules per kilogram, the LPI. It's basically normalized by the volume integral over the volume, where we have W squared here. This is the updraft velocity within the cloud. And this epsilon tells us something about the water mass, the ice mass in the cloud. It's basically the QI is the liquid, QI is the ice fractional content, how much ice we have. QL is the liquid water mass in the cloud, and the Q ice is more complicated because ice can be in different forms, can be as snow, can be as cloud ice, can be as grapple, and so the ice, the QI, the big QI, is made up of this calculation where we have the grapple. Grapple is a small, soft, wet hail. How much of that we have? The snow, the mixing ratio of snow, and the cloud ice, the QI, the mixing ratio of cloud ice, mixing ratio given in grams or kilograms per kilogram. And so this is a more realistic way, a more physical way of calculating the possibility of lightning, but it doesn't actually give you the discharge. It tells you the potential of having lightning in the cloud. And if we look at some of the simulations, we had a project where we were actually studying flooding, flash floods with lightning. And so you can see here the simulation. And here we're actually using what the model, which some of you are familiar with, the WRF model, the WRF model, which at that time we were not using a global model, but now I know also in Nizhny, they're using these models on a global scale to simulate at even, say, 1 kilometer resolution. So you can get information about the microphysics of the clouds. Here we can see something about this electric power in this LPI in the model at 2 different times and locations. This is in Israel, and you can see the actual observed lightning activity, which seems to have a fairly good correlation between the location of the lightning measured by our VLF network run by our electric power company and the actual simulated power index. One flood event we can see in Israel, you can see the lightning flashes. This is the actual observations as compared with rainfall, and actually LPI, this joules per kilogram, the simulated, and the rainfall for different locations for the same flooding event. But on the right, we can see the correlation between the power index for individual pixels in the model and for the actual lightning flashes with a fairly tight linear relationship between the two. In Greek, we did a study in Greece for the flood in Volos in 2006. And here too, we can see that power index shown in the solid curve and actual lightning data shown in the dashed curve, showing a similar temporal distribution. Another comparison here on the top for Italy. So this is the actual observations of lightning for a flooding event in Italy. The simulation of the LPI at a 4-kilometer spatial resolution and at a 1.3 kilometer spatial resolution. So the color here is the LPI in joules per kilogram, showing where we would expect to have the most lightning. Pay attention, these are different scales because of the spatial resolution. This one is zoomed in just to the small area here around the thunderstorms. And below a similar event over Israel, the actual cloud to ground lightning, the simulated LPI, and then just more in the center part of the country. So this is using much more microphysical based parameterization, and these kind of simulations could maybe be used with supercomputing in the future, although again, to simulate at 1 kilometer the whole planet is very time consuming, very computer intensive, and maybe that's where we should be shooting for, but I don't think we're there yet. So just a few words before I end about the future. What about the future of global warming? The changes in lightning in the future, and maybe thunderstorms too, are not only dependent on the surface temperature. I'm sure all of you know that the temperature decreases with altitude at a rate we call the adiabatic lapse rate of about 10 kilometers, 9.8 kilometers, 9.8 degrees per kilometer, so 10 degrees C per kilometer. And the formation of thunderstorms and lightning depend on the instability of the atmosphere and actually on the lapse rate, the profile with the altitude. So if we have a warming in the future at the surface, but at the upper atmosphere, we have a similar amount of warming, then the slope of the lapse rate remains the same, and we don't necessarily expect to see more thunderstorms. But if the surface actually warms more than the upper atmosphere, it means that the slope is actually steeper, more unstable atmosphere, we would expect to see more thunderstorms. But if the upper atmosphere actually warms up more than the surface, they're both warm, but we have more warming aloft, then maybe we have a stabilization of the atmosphere and we should have less thunderstorms. And so what's predicted for the future? So this is actually very interesting, because if we look at the future temperature profile, this is latitude, North Pole to South Pole, and pressure or altitude going from the 2030s to 60s to the end of the century, we see that the upper troposphere is warming a lot more than the surface. Exactly where we have the thunderstorms in the tropics, we actually see a warming at the surface, but more warming aloft. This would imply maybe that we should have less thunderstorms in the future, because we're actually stabilizing the atmosphere overall. On a climatological scale, the atmosphere is getting more stable. But when we run the models and we calculate the lightning at every time step, we actually see a 40% increase in lightning by 2100 in the regions where we have the thunderstorms today. And a number of studies have looked at this, and similar to what we saw with the Thunder Day data, we see that about for every 1 degree warming in the climate models, about a 10% increase in global lightning. So these are 3 different studies which have looked in different models and different calculations. So this appears to be a paradox. The atmosphere is getting stable with time, but we have more lightning. What's happening? Well, let's see if this is happening in reality as well. If we look at the rainfall data for 10 years from the TRIM satellite observed rainfall for 10 years, 98 to 2007, and the lightning data for 10 years, we see that the lightning data, if we want to rank the tropical centers for who has the most lightning, Africa has the most lightning, followed by South America and then Southeast Asia. But when we look at the rainfall, we have the opposite. Most of the rainfall is in Southeast Asia, followed by the Amazon, and Africa is the driest, but it has the most lightning. And if we look at these boxes here, the ITCZ, where we have lots of rainfall over the oceans in the intertropical convergence zone, we don't have much lightning there. And so on climatological scales, when we're looking at the future climate, we're looking at climatologies over 10 years, we actually see that the lightning prefers drier regions. When there's too much rainfall, we don't see much lightning. And we also know this from the monsoon, for example, in India. that during the actual monsoon rains, there's not much lightning. The lightning comes before and after the monsoon. So on a climatological scale, actually, lightning occurs during drier climates. Another example is the El Nino Southern Oscillation. Normally, in the western part of the Pacific, we have the warm pool, we have lots of convection, lots of rainfall. We have subsidence in the east with dry conditions and very little lightning. Well, in the El Nino years, around the peak of the El Nino, December, January, February, the convection shifts with the warm waters east, and we actually have subsidence, drying conditions, and extreme drought conditions actually over Southeast Asia, Borneo, Northern Australia. But when we look at the lightning activity, this is for the El Nino of December, January, February, 97, 98, the reds imply very dry conditions, precipitation anomalies. And in the La Nina, a year later, December, January, February, 98, 99, lots of blues above normal rainfall. We see that the lightning data from space, from satellite, shows that in the El Nino of this year, there was 57% more lightning activity than normal. So again, drier conditions, but generally more lightning activity. So what we think is happening also maybe in the future is that the dry conditions are resulting in less thunderstorms and less rainfall. But when we do manage to break through the inversion layer, or we have thunderstorms developing, they become a lot more intense, a lot more powerful, and we have a lot more lightning. And so maybe this answers the paradox of how on a climatic timescale, we're actually stabilizing the atmosphere, but nevertheless, we're going to see more lightning activity. Now, I have to mention one exception to the rule. I've said that lightning activity is planned to increase in the future, but as happens in science, a few years ago, in 2018, Finney published a paper showing that if you use a different parameterization based on the cloud ice flux in the convection, you actually see a decrease in lightning in the future in a warmer climate. Now, I should point out that when they use the same parameterization that we used based on the cloud top height, which is shown at the bottom, they do see an increase in lightning activity in a warmer climate. This is looking at the difference between 2000 and 2100, and using the cloud top height simulation, they see an increase of maybe 6 times 10 to the 8 flashes per year. All the red areas are increases in lightning activity in the future. The crossed out areas are where they're not significantly, there's no significant change, but we see the red areas are fairly significant changes in the future, even into Asia and Canada and up into Alaska, Siberia. But when they use a different parameterization based on the cloud ice flux on the top, it's actually interesting that in higher latitudes in Russia and in Scandinavia and Canada, they still see an increase, but in the tropics, where most of the lightning occurs, they see a decrease. And overall, they get a decrease of about 2 times 10 to the 8 flashes per year. So this is fairly controversial, but I should point out it's the only global simulation which has shown a decrease in lightning as the climate warms. There are a lot of questions also about this parameterization, but again, it shows you that how we actually calculate the lightning is very important, and the results can be very sensitive to the methodology that we use. Before I end, I just want to mention aerosols. Aerosols are also important and may change as the climate changes, and may need to be included also when we're trying to calculate lightning and thunderstorms. We all know that all cloud droplets form on cloud condensation nuclei, CCN, and they all form, and all ice forms on ice nuclei. And when we have low amounts of CCN, we generally have less droplets, but bigger droplets, and therefore they form rain, what we call warm rain, without the ice phase fairly quickly. And this is what happens often over the oceans: less CCN, more rain, but warm rain processes. And as we increase the aerosols in the atmosphere, there's more competition between the droplets. The droplets are much smaller. They can be taken up above the freezing level where they freeze, and we get the ice crystals. And as I mentioned, we need the ice and the supercooled droplets in the mixed phase to produce electrification. And hence, when we look at very clean environments like over the ocean, we can get heavy rainfall, but not much ice and not much lightning. But when we have more polluted atmospheres, then we get the clouds developing deeper into the atmosphere, more ice interactions with grapple and droplets, and more lightning activity. And so we need to maybe take this also into account, not just the number of grapple, but also the aerosols and maybe the size distribution. And to try to look at that, we had a paper which was looking at the impact of aerosols and smoke in particular on lightning activity. And we basically looked over South America again. The color contours here show you the aerosol optical depth, the amount of pollution from smoke. And we looked in this white box at the number of lightning flashes in different years, showed by the different colors here, and on different days, I think, or different months. And what we see is that when we really do have a clean, the aerosol optical depth is an index of how polluted the atmosphere is with aerosols, used based on satellite data. So when we do increase slightly the aerosols in the clean environments, then we start to get more ice forming and the particles are smaller, they go up higher, and we actually see a lot more lightning activity. But if we pass a threshold and we go to very high aerosol optical depth with too much smoke, then we have an opposite effect. We have actually a decrease in the lightning activity. And we think these are two different independent effects. One is a microphysical effect that I just told you about, that we have more aerosols, we can have smaller droplets, we have more ice phase electrification and more lightning activity. But if we have too much smoke, then the smoke starts to absorb solar radiation in the layer of the smoke, and it actually it causes the stabilization of the atmosphere, prevents the convection from actually forming. And we can see that here, if we have too much smoke between the clouds, then the layer of smoke will actually absorb solar radiation, warm up the atmosphere at a few hundred meters above the surface, and therefore, instead of having the regular lapse rate, we now start to have a more stable lapse rate until we go through the smoke, and therefore we can maybe develop small cumulus clouds, but we cannot develop the deep convective clouds to produce the thunderstorms. So to summarize and to conclude, and then we can open this up for questions. Lightning and thunderstorms are a hazard to the public, to aviation, to property infrastructures on the ground. And to forecast their short and long-term changes, we need to develop methodologies to calculate thunderstorm and lightning activity on global scales and global models. And the problem is that these models have coarse spatial resolution, and we have to estimate, parameterize these thunderstorms and lightning based on the parameters that the models give us, because we don't have all the parameters that we need on the micro scale and the small scales. The first method used was what I showed you from my PhD 30 years ago in the climate models, and surprisingly is still being used by many today, and relates the lightning activity to the convective clouds and to the height of the convective clouds at every time step in every grid box. Since then, there have been other parameterizations developed using other parameters in the models like CAPE, lifted index, ice flux, convective precipitation, and there are others, all of them with their pros and cons, but none that are necessarily better than all of the others. And recently, one parameterization by Finney shows actually a decrease in lightning activity in a warmer climate, but all the others show that lightning will increase at approximately at a rate of about 10% increase in lightning activity for every 1 degree warming. Whether Finney's decrease is correct, I think there needs to be more studies there. Whether his parameterization in other models also shows a decrease, I don't think people have checked that yet, but again, it provides some interesting questions about future research. And as model resolution improves and gets to finer and finer spatial resolution, parameterizations can start to use microphysical parameters, like I showed the lightning potential index, which uses more microphysical parameters, grapple, ice, updraft velocities in convective clouds, which can actually be simulated in the climate models. And while temperature is likely to impact lightning activity in the future, we also need to consider changes in the aerosol loading of the atmosphere as related to convection and microphysics. In some places of the world, like in California, in Europe, we're actually cleaning the atmosphere from aerosols. And as we move from, say, fossil fuels to renewable energy, we'll have less aerosols in the atmosphere. And this may impact the microphysics and the convection. and the lightning. In other areas, like in Africa or in India, where we have lots of air pollution, this may have a different impact on the lightning and the microphysics. And so this may have a different effect in different parts of the world. And so we need to also always consider aerosols and changes in aerosol when we want to think about the changes in lightning and thunderstorms. So with that, I'm finished. Thank you very much. And I'll be happy to take questions if there are.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Colin, very much for this clear presentation of this vast fields, and especially for explaining the general physics of the phenomena for people who are maybe not experts, and also about physical parameterizations that can be used and are used in climate models, which many of us are interested mostly in. Okay, so dear colleagues, there is time for questions now. Please raise your hands in Zoom, and we can start with Andrei Libolsky, please.
Colin, thank you for your presentation. I didn't quite get for this LIP calculations. Do you use updraft's velocity from the mass flux parameterizations, or you use the actual velocity you get on the grid? So for 1 kilometer, you already start to resolve some of the convection.
Yeah, so this is model output. So from the model calculated updrafts in the individual grid.
Oh, I see. And so it doesn't concern the actual parameterizations for the convection?
No, well, it depends what parameterization you use, because in say the WRF model, you can choose different convective schemes which have been developed by different people. And so each one will give you maybe a slightly different updraft and different grapple. So in our paper, you can see which we looked at that. We did sensitivity studies and to see which one gave the best results for our case studies, which may be specific to the Mediterranean. It may need to be tuned for every area, but you have to maybe look at the different convective schemes which are available for the WRF model or for any model, but we use the output of the convective scheme for the updraft velocity.
I see. And to follow up, is the sensitivity great to the convection parameterizations, at least in WRF? Or
it wasn't great, but you do see differences, obviously, with different schemes. But we do see differences. We did see differences between the schemes, and then we chose one scheme which appeared to be the best, and we stuck with that.
Yeah.
But we've seen since then there've been many papers using the LPI, and some of them use different convective schemes for their simulation. So maybe in China there may be a scheme which is maybe slightly better there, or in the United States maybe different. Maybe in Russia they're sensitive to different parameters. So this has to be firstly checked and studied before you actually use it operationally.
See, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Please, colleagues, any other questions? So I have a couple of questions. So Colin, that's just for curiosity. So you presented the chain of processes of the charge separation in an individual cloud. So, and you also mentioned that the smaller droplets mostly have positive charges, and the large droplets negative charge. So what is a specific reason for this kind of link between the size and the charge?
Well, most of the charging actually is occurring on ice, not droplets, although the droplets are involved. But the ice, so there are a few different mechanisms. One, say the thermoelectric effect, which can be on individual ice crystals or hail crystals, which is influenced by temperature gradients. And what happens is that because of the different temperature, the outer shell of the hail will get a positive charge, and the inside will get a negative charge. It all depends where it is in the cloud. And then when they collide together, the small splinters from the big hail particle will be the outer shell, giving us small crystals, which will be positive, with the inside will be negative. So that's one way of getting small ice crystals, which are positive, and the center nucleus will be negative. Other ways are the actual collisions between droplets. It turns out when you have the electric field in the cloud, or even in the fair weather electric field, you can get polarization, where you'll have positive at the top and negative of the particles as they fall through the atmosphere. And if you have larger particles falling faster and colliding with the smaller ones, during the time of the collision, you'll have transfer of negative charge to the bigger one, which will keep on going down, and you lose the negative and the smaller one will go up and remain positive. So it's actually quite a coincidence maybe that the smaller ones get, overall, they get the positive and the larger ones negative. Otherwise, if it was just random, we wouldn't have electric fields in the clouds because you would just have positive and negative mixed together all the time. It's also quite unique to the water molecule because of the structure of the water molecule, which can actually be polarized, and you can actually get the positive ions or the negative ions close to the surface. This also is what contributes to the buildup of charge in the cloud by the collisions and the breakup. If we were talking about other molecules, if the cloud was made out of nitrogen or oxygen, we wouldn't have this. Because of the asymmetry of the molecule, this is what allows the clouds to be charged. So there's something very special about water, which allows the lightning to actually be formed in the clouds.
Interesting, thank you. So, so any other questions? So I may continue. I have more. Yes. So in the beginning, the first part of your presentation, you showed this general picture of the cumulonimbus cloud and the different regions of charge. Yes, and this reminds me that beginning from I think 70s of last century, we've been developing, not in the community, develop the cloud models, cloud resolving hydrodynamic models with the like several hundreds or 100 meters of spatial resolutions, which is enough to explicitly resolve the cloud, the cycle of cloud development. Yes, and now we have, I guess, largely simulation models for this kind of cloud, single cloud simulation studies. And I wonder, are there this kind of models supplemented with more explicit treatment of electrical processes, like this kind of transport equations for charges and magnetohydrodynamics in general, I would say?
Yes, definitely. So there are individual cloud models or thunderstorm models where you have all the physics included there, or all the processes we think we know about, and you can then develop the charges and the charge centers in the cloud as a function of time. And you can then also develop a lightning discharge if you want. So most of the models are just predicting the generation of electric fields in the clouds. The next step is, when do you produce a lightning discharge, and how do you produce a lightning discharge, and how does it propagate to the ground? So that then takes you to a different community of scientists, normally engineers, who are trying to understand the leader process and how it propagates to the ground, and the return stroke and the charge and the current in the lightning. And these are very obviously very computer intense models, and you can't put all these processes into even regional models, never mind the global models. So it all depends what your goal is in research. If you're interested in lightning protection, then actually the thunderstorm is maybe less important, but the lightning process coming to the ground and the discharge and the ionization path, the return stroke, the current pulse, etc., is a lot, and the attachment process at the surface is much more important than actually generating the charge in the thunderstorm. And if you're interested more in the risks for whether it's forest fires or wind turbines, then you may want to know just the potential of having lightning in a certain region tomorrow in a certain area, and then more studying the meteorology and again the Graupel and the microphysics, the bulk microphysics of the cloud may be enough, and not necessarily the individual discharge and the individual fields in the cloud. So the models go at all different scales, from the very micro scale to generating the fields within the storm, the discharges, and then again going to the more bulk microphysics as I showed you, and then even to the climate model parameterizations. But definitely there are the very high spatial resolution and very detailed models of the generation of the charges all the way along those three processes I mentioned to you.
Okay, thank you. So we have Evgeny Volodin at this.
Yes, I have a question. Do you have simple explanation why you almost haven't flashes in the central equatorial Pacific, in spite of we have high top of the convective clouds, but in Africa you have almost the same upper boundary of convective clouds, but very many flashes.
Yeah, so I think that, well, what the observations show is that while the cloud top heights may be similar, which is basically the tropopause, the clouds, the convection goes up to the tropopause and stops there, both over the Central Pacific and over Central Africa, the updraft velocities, the intensity of that updraft is much, much weaker over the Central Pacific, over the ocean. In fact, measurements in planes flying through convection over many experiments over the oceans show that the updraft velocity never gets above, say, 10 meters per second over the oceans. Over the land, over Africa, and other places, you can get up to 50, 60 meters per second, the vertical winds going up. And the intensity of those updrafts is what firstly takes the supercool droplets and other droplets into the freezing zone to produce ice. If you don't have those updrafts, they don't get that high up in the atmosphere. But the more intense updrafts also influence those collisions between the ice crystals, the grapple, the droplets, which is for the charge transfer. So when you have weak updrafts, you don't have the particles going too high up, you don't have very much mixing and collisions between the droplets, so the processes are much slower. And a lifetime of a convective cell may be 1 hour. And so over the oceans, you may get very deep, very slow, deep convection, but it's just not intense enough to produce the electrification and the lightning. Over Africa, it's much more intense, and it happens fairly quickly. Within 20 minutes or so, you'll have lightning occurring, and you'll have lots of lightning because of the very strong updrafts. Why are the updrafts much stronger over Africa or over land than over the oceans? So this, we think, is a thermodynamic effect. Basically, the land is heating up much quicker over Africa during the afternoons, and that changes the lapse rate so that you're warming the surface, not necessarily the upper atmosphere, and you get very unstable atmosphere over Africa. But over the oceans, that solar energy is going to warm the waters and quite deep into the ocean. And so the air temperature above the oceans doesn't change that much during the daytime. If you look at the diurnal variation of temperature over the ocean, it's basically flat. There's no real change in the air temperature over the oceans, whereas over the land, you have a very strong peak in warming in the afternoon hours, which gives you this instability in the atmosphere, which drives these strong updrafts and then the electrification.
Yes, thank you. And can simple CAPE calculation explain this difference, or it is more complicated effect?
Well, in theory, CAPE should be able to, but CAPE, it also depends how you calculate the CAPE. CAPE is one of the parameters which is shown to be well linked to lightning, mainly in the tropics, because in the tropics, really, you have air mass thunderstorms going up. And so the more convective available potential energy you have, you should have stronger updrafts theoretically, and eventually, and people have shown, looking at CAPE and amount of lightning, there is a link, and the CAPE is lower over the oceans, but not that much lower. So it's not only the CAPE, but definitely CAPE explains part of the difference between the lightning over the land and ocean. It's also the CAPE is one number for the whole integral of the column of the atmosphere. Where that CAPE is located, in what layers it's located, is also important.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Evgeny. Yes, thank you, Colin, for answering. Any other specific questions for for Colin. So yes, I have a follow-up of Evgeny's question, by the way, about CAPE. So you mentioned several parameters, yes, as predictors for number of thunderstorms in cell and CAPE and humidity and some others. And I was surprised that there is no, you didn't mention the vertical wind shear, which might be important for the thunderstorm development, as it is well known that if you have no vertical wind shear, so the cycle of the sound of the cloud is much shorter, and if you have this more significant wind shears, then it's high probability for having a long development for large supercell storm.
Yeah, so wind shear is really only that very important in the middle latitudes, like your supercell, like a mesoscale convective system, like the United States, when you have tornadoes developing, and also the tropical storms, hurricanes, when you have high wind shear, then that you don't have difficult formation of tropical storms. That needs to be fairly vertical, the structure, and wind shear kind of tears it apart. But thunderstorms in the tropics, and that's the majority in the world, most of the lightning, most of the thunderstorms is in the tropics. Wind shear is less of a problem there, I think. I don't think that it may have some influence, but it's not a major factor for linking how much lightning occurs. So there may be, it may be a third or fourth order effect on the lightning, but it's not a main predictor of how much lightning you'll get.
Okay, interesting. So if there are no more questions, so we can, we might have some comments from the audience. Evgeny Anatolyevich, maybe you have.
First of all, I'm happy that Colin will give this interesting talk. I could just say thanks a lot to Colin and to inform all of the participants that we are working on the search for the parameterizations for lightning flash rates, which would be from the first principle and could, by the rather natural way, to take into account the differences between the ocean and land in terms of the lightning. Also, there are a lot of interesting questions concerning the connection between the so-called parameterization of global electric circuit, where the main factor is the quasi-stationary current provided by the electrization processes interior the clouds. And it is very interesting that sometimes there is a lot of clouds which have rather big amounts of this current and a big contribution to the global circuit, but they do not provide much lightning. This is very interesting problem, and it is just a topic of our research now and for the nearest future.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, that basically every cloud you see in the sky has electric charge inside. Every cloud is charged somewhat, but lightning only occurs when you pass a certain threshold. And so these deep convective clouds in the middle of the Pacific, which don't have much lightning, are still electrically charged. And so they can still affect the currents flowing in the atmosphere above these storms and can affect what we call the global electric circuit, which has two components. It's one is actually the lightning and the thunderstorms, and the other are other electrified clouds, but without lightning, what we call shower clouds. They may have rain, but no lightning. And so this is also interesting, this difference between electrified clouds with no lightning and electrified clouds with lightning.
Okay, thank you, Evgeny Anatolyevich, for your comments and the answer from the response from Colin. So if we have no any other comments. So let me say some conclusion, provide some conclusion from my point of view. So today we have seen very interesting talk, and thank you especially, Colin, for your exhaustive answers to the questions, to the short questions, and then we had very exhaustive answer for every of them. Thank you very much for that as well. And so we are very interested in this direction of research. I mean the inclusion of electrical phenomena in the Earth system models. And so, for example, Evgeny Volodin was answering one of questions. He is the leader of development of Russian Earth system model, and we have collaboration with Evgeny Anatolievich on this topic for many years. And also in this group led by Colin in Nizhny, during recent years, new parameterizations for using in large-scale atmospheric models have been developed, and they can be included in the new generation of Earth system model. And so this is, of course, one of important, from a practical point, important extension of the Earth system model in terms of practical importance of the output of the electrical variables for the reasons that Colin mentioned in the very beginning of his talk. And so, of course, we are very eager. I didn't ask this question, but it would be very interesting to see someday the feedbacks of electrical processes on the hydrodynamics of the climate system. And this will, I feel that this will happen someday, and it will also provide even more interesting questions, propose even more interesting questions in this direction. So I hope that this research will, in the collaboration, Colin, with our teams will continue. And thank you again, Colin, Evgeny, all the people who asked questions and participated in this discussion, and all the listeners, and hope to meet you again online and offline. And by this, we finish this spring session of our seminar, and we will now enter the summer period and meet you again in September. And we will have again announcements of the September meeting, I think in beginning of September or end of August. So thank you again, and be healthy, and see you.